I genuinely cannot remember the last time I read this many books in a month, like to the point where I'm pretty sure I can undiagnose myself with depression. Hello beautiful people, my name is Vendi and today I'm bringing you my April reading wrap up. I'm going to do this as quickly as I can because I have 16, yes you heard that right, 16 books to get through today. I do get to cheat a little bit because several of the books that I'm going to be mentioning here are ones that I've already read and reviewed in my previous video, my sci-fi reading vlog, which I'll have linked in the description box below. Starting with the first book that I read this month, which was Zenith by Sasha Alsberg and Lindsay Cummings. This book is a romp of a space opera following space pirate Andy, or Androma Rosella, and her crew of misfit adventurers as they are sort of pulled into a one last job sort of scenario by the leader of Andy's home planet from which he has been exiled. Zenith is a pretty chunky book, clocking in at over 500 pages, so obviously there's more to it than that. But again, if you want to hear my further thoughts about it, I will point you to my previous video again to hear about that. The cheating continues because the second book that I read in April was A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers, the series starting with the book A Psalm for the Wild-Built, which was one of my favorite books that I read last year. The series follows a tea monk named Dex. They are essentially a traveling therapist who makes tea for a variety of people all around their world. And when Dex is kind of hit with a quarter-life crisis, they go out past the human-populated lands into the woods. Robots have basically faded into legend until Dex meets a robot named Moscap. This book continues Dex and Moscap's story, where Moscap is now being introduced into the human world and learning what it is that humans need. I adored this book and I could gush about it for ages, but again, I'm going to point you to my thoughts in my previous video instead because so much to get through today. The first book I actually get to talk about in this video is Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. Bright Young Women follows Pamela, who in 1978 was one of the survivors of a serial killing blitz attack that left her sorority house basically in a shambles and her best friend dead. In the 1978 timeline, because this is a dual timeline story, Pamela is working with a woman named Tina, and Tina believes that the same man who killed Pam's sorority sisters also killed one of Tina's friends previously earlier in his serial killing career. In the 1978 storyline, Pam and Tina have to work together to convince the police, who aren't necessarily interested in believing Pam's accounting of what happened and who are trying to sort of push the entire situation under the rug as a sort of unladylike thing. And Pam goes through a tremendous amount of indignity in trying to bring justice to not only her best friend, but the woman who Tina is looking for justice for as well. That story intertwines with the story of Pamela in the present day, who is doing a tremendous amount better and who has finally been given the ability to get justice for Tina's friends as well. I adore Bright Young Women, not only because it was a tense and harrowing story, not only in the scenes where, actual brutal killing was going on, but in all of the aftermath scenes as well, and all of Pamela and her other sorority sisters having to reckon with a world wherein their pain is not something the world wants to focus on. But it was also such a beautifully resilient story. I really enjoyed that despite having to work within the confines of the societal structure that she was in, Pam made the absolute best of those situations and pushed up against those boundaries, finding allies wherever she could in her single-minded drive to bring peace to the soul of her dead best friend. I think the trauma of something like this was handled beautifully, and I was really pleased to see that, unlike what usually happens where the violent man, the serial killer, the person who is in an act of sort of unbridled misogyny harming women, rather than him being centered, it is very much the experiences of his victims and his survivors that is centered. At every stage of the game, Jessica Knoll makes it very clear that Pam is the smarter one here, that the killer is truly just a small misogynistic man, and that the stories about his super brilliant self and his excellent way that he managed to charm these women, all of those are blown out of proportion. And in fact, those are narratives that are pushed by a deeply patriarchal system to avoid having to reckon with the fact that they are failing women. And despite that infuriating truth, Pam and the other sorority sisters and Tina are always the ones on the back foot because of the societal roadblocks put in their way in terms of not just seeking justice and being allowed to seek justice in a societally acceptable way, but also in just generally being allowed to move on and feel safe afterward. On one hand, it's a very, serial killer thriller type story, but on another hand, it's very much just a story about the female condition and about female rage and the ability of women to get shit done, as it were. I think the braiding of the timelines was done really well. There wasn't one that I preferred to read in, and I feel like Jessica Knoll switched between them in such a way that the pacing of the book was made extra fast simply by my enthusiasm to get through this part that I get very, very interested in while I'm in it, because the cliffhanger she left me off on wants me to get back to that previous timeline as well, if that makes sense. Overall, I think this was a smart book. I think it was well crafted, and I really, really enjoyed my read of Bright Young Women. Following that, I read Scared Little Rabbits by A.V. Geiger. This is a book that I mentioned in my previous video but didn't get into. Scared Little Rabbits follows Nora, a girl in basically a STEM summer camp. She and a bunch of other teens are competing to create either a mechanical thing or some sort of software and compete against one another in a essentially glorified science fair, that the winner of which will get a really big scholarship at the end of it. Nora is a self-proclaimed awkward loner and doesn't really have much in the way of friends. She's very much more comfortable behind a computer screen typing away on her laptop, but she's determined that during this experience she will also sort of broaden her social horizons by way of an app that a alumnus of this program developed during his time there. And partly by way of this app and partly by way of her sort of exemplary coding skills, she's sort of drawn into, but not really because she's always sort of at the outskirts. Basically, she's drawn into this group of these like very popular people who are working on an add-on to the app because one of them is related to the person who invented it in the first place. And long story short, one of those girls ends up dead, and all of the evidence points to it being Nora who killed her. So Nora basically needs to figure out how to clean up her digital footprint and find the real killer before she gets in trouble for a crime that she did not commit. I kind of struggled to summarize that sort of Act 1 into the inciting incident bit that I try to do for all the books that I mention on this channel, because the inciting incident of this book took place about 2/3 of the way through it, and the last third was a very, very rushed, kind of jumbled race to the finish. By far my biggest problem with Scared Little Rabbits was the pacing. The first 2/3 where Nora was sort of just in this summer camp and trying to make friends and sort of being pushed to the outskirts and making an embarrassment of herself and having a crush on this guy, all of that just stretched out on, and it got really repetitive the way that it was written, and nothing was really happening to push the book toward the sort of back cover blurb copy that I tried to kind of summarize here. Clues were being dropped along the way that we were going toward a girl going missing and dying. The prologue did tell us it was going to happen, but by the time we got there, I was sort of over it. Nora was a difficult protagonist to be in the head of. She was really down on herself, and not in a way that was interesting to read about. Her self-esteem seemed to depend on what the plot needed it to be at that given point in time. Most of the time, she distanced herself from people, and I'm like, how are you going to have a plot that involves sort of social intrigue without being social, or at least being adjacent to where the social stuff is happening? If you're constantly pushing away all the other characters and locking yourself in a little room, it's really hard for anything interesting to happen. She wasn't a bad character, she was just sort of a boring one, and I think that's worse. And by the time the exciting incident finally did roll around and that girl wound up dead, the other girl's name is Eleanor. Nora's name is also Eleanor, which is why I'm just calling her that other girl, because if I have to go between Nora and Eleanor again, I'm going to lose my mind. Anyway, by the time the other girl was found dead, there was not enough page space left to adequately untangle all the ways that she was led to that position in the first place. I feel like if the first 2/3 were condensed into 1/3 of the book and the last 1/3 was expanded into 2/3, the story might even have been able to work, because by that point, Nora would have to be involved with other people to sort of untangle the web that led the police and everyone else to believe that she was the one that killed Eleanor. A lot of my problems with this book probably would have been resolved were the pacing resolved. Alas, that is not what we got, and that's why I'm not holding a physical copy of Scared Little Rabbits with me. It is in my unhaul pile and will be finding another home very soon. After that, I read an entire sort of series of companions of historical romance books called the Matchmaker Series by Nancy Campbell Allen. This begins with the Matchmaker's Lonely Heart, followed by To Capture His Heart, and rounding out the series with Protecting Her Heart. The Matchmaker series follows a set of cousins, Amelie, Ava, and Charlotte, who are all sort of more modern women who have taken the Victorian world and decided, oh, with the advancement of like industry and stuff, gender roles are slowly changing. So all of us are going to try to make our own money and sort of have a life for ourselves that's outside of the traditional get married, have babies, be a homemaker, rinse and repeat sort of thing that was the standard up until that point. And the way that they are doing this is by working on a sort of romance column, talking about the various scandals and matches being made in the ton run by their shared aunt. It is during one of her attempts to seek out a scoop about a eligible bachelor about town that Amelie Hampton ends up running into Detective Michael Baker, who is seeking out the same eligible gentleman because he believes that that man is a person of interest, as it were, relating to what Michael believes was a murder. In fact, the murder of his wife. I really enjoyed Michael and Amelie's story, not just because it had a lot of that grumpy sunshine dynamic that I tend to find just really charming in my historical romances especially, but because I just liked each of the characters independently as well. Amelie is very much an optimist and a romantic, and she's hoping for the absolute best from people even when they don't necessarily deserve her optimism and goodwill. And as it turns out, that sort of can-do spirit pushes her into doing things that other people might have given up on in advance because they just don't believe that they could have any sort of results. And that turns out to be exactly the sort of thing that Michael needs within this investigation. He also doesn't shy from the ugliness of things, but he's very much become a little bit jaded, and he doesn't really have a way with people. And in order to do his job here, he very much does need to be able to do a little more schmoozing, a little bit more connecting with the society of the ton, and getting close to the various persons of interest that are necessary to bring justice to this murdered woman. I really enjoyed watching Amelie sort of needle him into deputizing her, which becomes like their sort of little back and forth thing throughout the book. Like, oh, you should just deputize me. And he's like, I'm not going to deputize you. And it goes from a grudging sort of, oh, I'd rather not have to work together, into a mutual respect, and eventually into a deep fondness for one another. These are clean romance books, and I hate that term because I don't think sex is dirty. I feel like using language to that effect is ultimately detrimental in almost every possible way. But just so you know, in case that's not the sort of romance you're into, and perhaps because the author then wasn't doing much like kissing into a build up to sex, which is often how a progression of that sort of thing goes in a more traditional type romance, I did find the romantic confession scene to have happened a little bit abruptly. Like, I didn't really see the jump from fondness to love as organically as I saw the other progressions go, but ultimately I really enjoyed that story. To Capture His Heart then follows Eva Caldwell, one of Amelie's cousins, who is a photographer that has ended up using her photography in the more macabre setting of taking autopsy photos. And she and Michael's detective partner, Nathan Winston, end up going to Nathan's mother's house, where she's trying to do like a matchmaking event sort of thing for a bunch of, again, eligible young women and men of the ton. Ava is originally there to do photography for the event, but when yet more foul play ends up happening at the scene of the party, she and Nathan end up teaming up to figure out what's going on and get to the bottom of it. Since Ava and Nathan have a pre-existing relationship, not romantic, but just professional and friendly, I felt that the build of their feelings felt a little bit more organic. There's a little bit of mutual pining going on, which is another trope that I just really enjoy. It's kind of my bread and butter in terms of historical fiction, just because those sorts of stories tend to have more like social mores, and there's like propriety to take into account. And so if you do have feelings for somebody, it's a little bit more high stakes to talk about that. But still, seeing the two of them be put into these situations where those feelings were allowed to bloom and grow was really nice. I really like that Nathan's mom wants to just marry him off. I love a big family type of guy. And Nathan's whole gaggle of sisters sort of just opening their arms to Ava and just liking her from the start just made me really happy. And though I'm not a big fan of girl hate as a general rule, I did really enjoy seeing Ava hold her own against some women who weren't necessarily into the idea of her being self-made and using her photography as a form of generating her own personal income. That was mitigated some by the other people around her who were thrilled for her and just absolutely happy to see a woman doing this, because obviously while this sort of wave of feminism was quite new at the time, so not everybody would have been like thrilled about the bucking of old historical norms, as people often are. It was still good to see that evidence of times changing. And I really enjoyed how delighted Nathan was by Eva's competence. I totally get how a romantic interest is interested in somebody else if what they're admiring about them is their competence at a task that they do, especially if that thing that they do is a personal passion as well. So just watching that mutual admiration grow and bloom was Chef's kiss, lovely. And the series rounds out with Protecting Her Heart, which follows Charlotte Duvall and her growing relationship with police director John Ellis, who is basically Michael and Nathan's boss. This story takes place several years after the others. Once Charlotte has finished her medical school studies in the United States, she is called back to England by a letter from her dying father, who basically insinuates that her mother's death earlier on in Charlotte's childhood was maybe the result of foul play, and Charlotte has to kind of get to the bottom of this. Unfortunately, her father does end up dying before she gets there, but rather than turn around and go back to the States where she has a job and everything lined up, Charlotte decides that she cannot go back until she figures things out, and she and John decide to dig deeper into this sort of higher echelon of society and figure out what skeletons certain people are hiding in their closets. I really enjoyed Charlotte's story. I feel that because she was given so much backstory in the previous two novels, she was allowed to have a lot more depth than Ava and Amelie did necessarily. Not that Ava or Amelie were not full of their own types of depth, but I feel like Charlotte got to have a little more. I think that also is helped by the fact that she is, 25, 26, so a person with a fully formed prefrontal cortex by the time her romance rolls around. She's just lived a little bit more life than the other two, so it's easier for her to have a more mature relationship bloom with John. The two of them have a sort of mutual attraction pretty early on, but rather than the quiet pining that happened in the previous book, this is much more of a companionable, we already know that we are really good partners together and we are really good friends type of deal. So when their relationship goes from friendship into a deeper love, with John very much letting Charlotte know from the start, whatever you do, I'll wait for you as long as you need me to. And I know that you can't necessarily get married because being a doctor requires you not to be married. I thought it was really sweet for him to prioritize her in that way, and I really enjoyed that the sort of roadblock to their relationship was society more so than any sort of will they won't they thing that they had to deal with. I just really enjoyed the variety between the three different types of romances we got in this series. We got to see more of Charlotte's professional growth on page as well, and I just think it did a really great job of rounding out the series overall. And that kicked me off into somewhat of a romance mood, but my fantasy mood was also there, so I did what any good reader would do and combined the two by reading The Longing of Lone Wolves and The Secrets in Shadow and Blood, two novels in the sort of Fae Guardian series by Lana Paherchik. The Longing of Lone Wolves follows a girl named Clark from our contemporary time. She's a psychic who does a little bit of grifting in order to stay alive because her parents kind of abandoned her once her gift became clear. But when a boyfriend that she trusted ends up telling a sketchy sort of man about Clark's powers, she ends up using her psychic gift to give him some nuclear codes, which plunges the world essentially into an apocalypse. Several hundred years later, Clark wakes up to a world that's newly green and refreshed. It turns out the apocalypse didn't quite take, and she finds herself surrounded by wolf-shifting elves who are in a sort of eternal battle with humans, and they, upon finding Clark, want her pretty instantly dead. However, she ends up avoiding this fate by pledging herself to a different wolf shifter, a man named Rouge, who none of the others are able to see. And because Clark promises to be Rouge's hands and mouthpiece to interact with the world on his behalf because he kind of can't do it anymore, the two of them are bound together and the story commences from there. In many ways, The Longing of Lone Wolves is a pretty standard sort of urban fantasy / romantasy type of dealio, particularly of the shifter romance variety, with a little bit of an alpha hole brooding guy and a kind of feisty and self-contained but still needs help making her way around this very changed landscape woman. But I did have fun with Rouge and Clark's relationship, especially as Rouge sort of learned to bring his walls down, finally around the first person who's been able to see him in ages after he's been cursed, and him sort of growing out of his hatred for humans by viewing Clark as an individual, and also Clark kind of giving up on the guilt of what she's done and realizing that the coercion that she was placed under doesn't make it her fault, but it does a little bit still leave it her responsibility to do what she can to keep the world that she's in now safe. Frankly, there was more plot and more coherent plot to this book than I expected from a romantasy. Even the things that are sort of eye-rolling, like couples can only have one child and there's a very specific breeding program that's governmentally controlled in state because there's simply not enough resources to go around. Even that made sense given the context of the rest of the world being a sort of post-apocalyptic nightmare that they are just slowly getting back on its feet. I like that Clark had to learn how to use her power more effectively and that it was not just sort of crazy psychosis as she assumed it was back in the mortal world, but in fact something that ties her inextricably to this version of the world as well, and that she can use for the betterment of its people, for better or worse. But she's also not like crazy overpowered. She doesn't suffer from that like romantasy main character syndrome where suddenly she's like, well, she's gone full Mary Sue. Clark doesn't do that. Clark is still very much flawed, and her ability to affect the world very much depends on her ability to interact within it, and Rush is a very good mouthpiece for her in that way. But ultimately, what matters most for me in any romance is that the two are very good for one another, and Rush and Clark are really good for one another. I had a lot of fun with this book. I followed that up with The Secrets of Shadow and Blood, which follows Violet and Indigo. This is actually the fourth book of this series. I kind of made a mistake. So the way the Fae Guardians books are going to go is that there is 4 separate trilogies following the various types of guardians. And I sort of made the assumption that each trilogy was its own sort of standalone thing, so that I could start with the first book of the second trilogy and the first one not having too much impact on it. This was incorrect. I don't recommend doing what I did. But regardless, this book follows Violet and a vampire shifter named Indigo. Like Clark, Violet ends up waking up in this world suddenly after basically the apocalypse happens, and she assumes that she's died. Upon entering this world, she is caught by some vampires and experiences like a pretty traumatic thing along with some other women. She and the other women end up having to split up because the 3 of them together draw yet more vampires upon themselves. So unfortunately, they are most safe when they are alone. And Violet, who was a physicist previously, decides, okay, I'm going to go full throttle into being a vampire hunter and stopping what they did to me from happening to everyone else. But as I assume is explained further in the 2 books that I missed in the series, Violet is one of 12 women who are in one way or another tied to the creation of the nuclear apocalypse that ended up happening. And thus the Fae Guardians are going after these women and trying to get to them before the dark powers that be get to them and basically complete the destruction of the earth. But Violet has some feelings about vampires, so when Indigo catches up to her, she and he do not necessarily get along very well at first. And Violet is especially irked when it turns out that she and Indigo are well best mates and they are basically destined to fall in love. This book was very much romance focused. I get that the first book is always going to do a little bit more in terms of world building and plot building and all that, but this one was very much the Indigo and Violet relationship at the heart of it. I don't know that I liked Indigo as much as a romantic interest. He was a little bit pushier than Rush was in the previous book. They were both, very like alpha male-y in the way that very often is the case in shifter romances and any sort of romantasy in general. But Indigo was a little bit more flippant than I personally enjoyed, and I didn't necessarily see him and Violet as good for one another as I saw Clark and Rush to be. Regardless, I still found the story interesting, and I will be continuing with the series. It's very fun, like book candy, but I will be reading the rest of them in the proper order. I continued on this romantasy kick by reading another Ruby Dixon book, Bound to the Shadow Prince. This book follows Kendra, who is the 3rd daughter of a kingdom of humans who are at war with a race of being known as Felians. And in order to keep natural disaster from arising, a human princess of one specific family, such as Kendra's, and a Felian prince have to go together into this sort of isolationist castle that is blessed by a moon goddess and stay there in total isolation for 7 years. They're not allowed to leave, like to step foot outside of the castle at all. Kendra is very much a party girl. She loves the glitz and the glam of court. She's very much like a princess of her people. And because she's the 3rd born and because she has something known as the blood sickness, a chronic condition that she needs to basically get daily medicine for or else she will die, not much was ever expected of Kendra. She did not have to continue the line. In fact, she physically can't because her blood sickness makes her barren, nor could she, because of her illness, be alone in a castle for 7 years at a time. And also, Kendra hates isolation. She loves being around people. She loves being an asset who takes care of her sister in terms of being her eyes and ears around court. But when the sister who was destined for the tower ends up drowning at sea, Kendra is sort of roped in as a last-minute, last-ditch effort to keep from angering the moon goddess and set off to the castle in her place. In the castle, Kendra is left with Nemeth, the Felian prince, who has been training basically to go to this castle for his whole life, and the 2 of them are not fans of one another, to say the least, especially at first. But after a time, they grow to rely on one another. Kendra definitely needs Nemeth a little bit more in terms of staying alive, but Nemeth winds up needing her just as much because because until he met her, he was just a being of duty. Very, very slowly, the two of them begin to fall in love and care for one another. But all is not well in the outside world, and when their supplies begin to not arrive anymore, the two of them decide that the only way to keep Kendra alive and get her the ingredients she needs for the life-saving medication that she still needs to take is for them to leave the castle and incur the goddess's wrath. I really enjoyed Bound to the Shadow Prince. It has a lot of kind of what I call classic Ruby Dixon romance in terms of like protagonists who are kind of made for one another and a really doting and devoted and caring male love interest. But I feel like Bound to the Shadow Prince is sort of Ruby at her best in terms of writing complexity into a romance like this as well. The hatred that the two of them feel for one another, especially from Kendra's point of view, while not justified in any way, it's very much built off of a sort of prejudice, is still very much real and is a thing that they need to overcome, not only to become friends, but then eventually lovers as well. And as the story goes on and certain things happen between the two kingdoms, those bonds are tested somewhat abruptly. Those prejudices and hatreds kind of gain a little bit more merit because people do kind of terrible things to one another during a war. Kendra's one of my favorite Ruby Dixon protagonists. She doesn't have what I would call a very good head on her shoulders, but she has a very interesting head on her shoulders. She has a talent for certain things that I guess you would call a little bit more leaning toward like the emotional intelligence side of things. She's very good at making friends and sort of figuring out who she can kind of get her hooks in to get them to help her. I really enjoy the way that she needles Nemeth a little bit and kind of gets him to come out of his shell. She's very much the more forward of the two of them and pushes a lot of their relationship development forward. And I really like an active protagonist, especially an active heroine. A lot of times when exploring romances, there is a sort of like bashfulness baked into the heroines in terms of seeking their own pleasure. And Kendra was very candidly and openly into sex. She really enjoyed and owned her sexuality in a way that was quite refreshing to see. And I really enjoyed her sort of schooling Nemeth in the ways of making love and also just being in love, because I don't think he got to have so much of that. I really enjoyed that the story didn't end after they fell in love, but that they had like trials and tribulations that tested their bond with one another afterward. Following that, I read one of the Hugo nominees for this year, The Saint of Bright Doors by Vajra Chandrasekhara. This book follows Feder, the son of a living saint whose mother has basically raised him from childhood in order to assassinate his father and end his father's legacy. Sort of luckily for himself in terms of getting out of a tremendous, terrible childhood indoctrination that would force him to end half of his family line. Feder grows out of it and ends up moving from his rural small town into the big city. He does a lot of therapy, especially in a group with other people who are like him, who are the sort of rejected children of gods and saints and prophecies. In the city, a connection to divinity and as sort of sect of some sort of faith is basically a dime a dozen, and there are unfortunately thus a lot of rejects as well, and they kind of band together to create a support group for what they've all gone through. But there is also a racialized and capitalist caste system going on as well. So Feder has to learn how to navigate a very socially complicated world while also getting over the sort of childhood trauma and the things he had to learn how to do in his very early youth. But a wrench is sort of thrown into all of that when one of the people in his support group kind of asks several of the others for their help in liberating some of these more lower caste people from a pretty terrible fate, one which is coinciding with Feder's Saint Father's arrival to the city that he hasn't come into in just many, many years. And one of Feder's tasks for this sort of grand plan is to infiltrate the government program of people who are watching these things called the Bright Doors, doors around the entirety of this city that are completely shut. They are brightly painted and beautiful, and some sort of weird energy comes through them. But these are in essence doors to nowhere. Or so it seems until Feder does a little bit more digging into them. That summary did not do this book justice. There are layers upon layers upon layers to The Saint of Bright Doors. It concerns itself with colonialism. It concerns itself with the idea of the victor being the one who ends up getting to write what the story is. There's time loop fuckery, and it's an incredibly queer story. If you like a story with intergenerational trauma, it's there for you in leaps and bounds. I think Feder is a triumph of a protagonist, the way that he sort of slips into whatever role he needs to, and in many ways ends up losing himself into those roles as well, because that's what he was taught to do growing up, to the point where at times he doesn't even remember who the core of him really is anymore. I think that was beautifully done. Vaja Chandrasekhara really puts Feder through the paces. It's not an easy story for him. The world and the city of Luriat is beautiful, and I really enjoyed the little hints that we get about how the entirety of the society works and how when Feder occupies different roles in this society and different sort of understandings of Luriat given the sort of papers he's holding and the beliefs that other people have around him, when he gets access to these different viewpoints, he gets access to practically different cities. I think the world was beautifully done. I think having a sort of scientific way to approach what seems like a very magical phenomenon was really interesting to read about. I really enjoyed Feder and his mother's relationship. It's incredibly fraught, and I'm glad that it was given the room to breathe on page so that the complexity of it could be explored, because on one hand, she hurt him very, very badly, but on the other hand, she prepared him for exactly what he needed to be. And even the ending by which the plot resolved itself, which frankly, I didn't think it could until that sort of twist at the end kind of came through. Even that I really enjoyed, even when I don't necessarily love a twist at the end, because this one I feel was seeded very appropriately from the start, and it was very much on me for not sort of asking myself a very critical question from the start of the novel to explain how the end results of the story happened. I think The Saint of Bright Doors was phenomenally done. I think it's more than earned its Hugo nomination, and it is going to be some tough competition for the other books that I'm going to be reading when I'm casting my vote for the Hugos this year. Perhaps predictably, after such a deep and rich, meaty book, I read a very easy thing as a palate cleanser. It's called Hey You Up for a Serious Relationship, How to Turn Your Booty Call into Your Emergency Contact by writer duo Brian Murphy and Emily Axford. Murph and Emily are a comedy duo who I first learned about through just the variety of D&D things they do. And this book is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a sort of comedic, tongue-in-cheek guide basically for how to turn a booty call into your emergency contact, how to like do relationships good for each of the sort of steps of the relationship. So like going from like just scoping out people at a bar to like actually dating to moving in together, etc. Murph and Em sort of started off with telling a little bit about their story, and then they go into both some like really common sense advice for how to do relationships good, and also like interspersing that with some like comedy. They do a disclaimer at the start of the book basically saying like, hey, this is a comedy book first and foremost. Some of this advice that we're going to give you is not advice at all, and like use your best judgment about it, which like I don't know that anyone who like understands how the English language works would actually consider some of that advice to be like advice proper. But regardless, it was a laugh. I really enjoy the comedy that both Murph and Emily do. So reading it was quite familiar, and I got a couple chuckles out of it, not gonna lie. I followed that up with reading Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. This is another one that I read and went into detail about in my previous vlog, so I will point you back again in that direction for more of my thoughts on this book. And then I completed Rouge by Mona Awad. But Rouge follows the story of a 30-something woman named Belle who goes to LA after her mother dies to attend the funeral and sort of deal with her affairs. Belle is very obsessed with her beauty regimen, specifically with her skincare. She is a mixed race young woman, and you could tell that that has dredged up some trauma based on her very, very white mother's expression of beauty standards. And it's clear that Belle has internalized a lot of like racism regarding that and is constantly looking to brighten herself and make herself younger and make herself look more and more like her mother did. Belle's devotion to her skincare is, well, it's just that. It's a devotion. It's an obsession. So when she gets to LA and is working on dealing with fixing up her mother's estate and dealing with her mother's debts, it is basically inevitable that she is drawn toward the spa where her mother was taking some beauty treatments as well to do some treatments of her own. Everyone around Belle's mom has told Belle that she was acting really erratically and really weird before she ended up dying by what appears to be suicide in the sea. And after attending certain treatments at this spa, Belle begins to behave in the same way. Her reality gets a little bit fuzzy. She begins forgetting things. She begins mixing up her words, and she begins to sort of remember certain events that happened in her earlier childhood that kind of led her to be in this position that she's in now in terms of her obsession with the way that she looks, the way that her skin is, etc. And some very dark secrets begin to come out, not just about Belle and Belle's mother, but about the spa itself as well. Rouge was a weird little book. I did enjoy it very much, but it took me quite a while to get through. I think in part because it was really hard at the start to not kind of get worked into an anxious tizzy while living in Belle's head. And while Belle's obsessions were not of the obsessive compulsive variety, at least that's not what it seemed like, she was very much in a thought spirally sort of place, and that was not a thing that I could kind of safely get into personally at the time. But once the sort of mystery and the plot kicked in and we got to see a little bit more of Belle's history as well and her relationship with her mother develop, and the sort of obsessive spirals about what Belle was doing personally with her skincare kind of took a back seat. Also in part because Belle was now going to the spa and that was doing wonders for her. That became a little bit easier to sort of get past, and I was really like swept away by the, I want to say whimsicality, but like a dark version of whimsicality of Mona Awad's writing. Rouge felt a little bit like a fever dream at times, where I was kind of questioning the reality of Belle's perception of the world and also about what I thought about what reality was within this book. I wanted to sort of interrogate my instinct to be like, no, Belle's actually wrong here, and her perception of what is real is incorrect, and I know what's really happening. And I think in the end, I was kind of right to do so. The reality of what was going on in the spa was kind of crazy, and the truth was somewhere in between what Belle was seeing and what I sort of interpreted from her vision of what was going on. I love a messy mother-daughter story. I love messy relationships between a parent and a child, and despite there being a lot of love between Belle and her mother, there was also so much rich envy and anger, and as we got more information about that, that only enriched the story further. There was some elements of romance to the story as well, but very much Mona Awad was centering Belle's narrative and the narrative between Belle and her mom more strongly, and I think that was the right choice for a story like this, for a story where this sort of intergenerational trauma is kind of at the heart of it. A like sleeper important character was Belle's father, who was just not around at all for any of the story, but his sort of shadow over it all ended up being quite important. At first, there was resentment from him on Belle's part because she kind of blamed him and his genetics for why she couldn't fit in amongst her peers and sort of achieve the beauty standards that her mother, whether advertently or not, set up for her. But ultimately it was in the accepting of him that Belle managed to save herself in the end. Or rather, by accepting herself for who she was and herself for being a product of him, that did end up saving her. I am glad that it was very much a story centering women and the standards placed upon them more than anything else. I think the sort of surrealist parts of the book, I think the parts that are more spec-ficky, horror-y, monstrous, were a lovely addition. I sort of expected it to be more metaphorical monsters than literal ones, but I didn't mind their inclusion. I enjoyed Rouge as a secretly genre book very much, but I'll never say no to monsters personally, so that probably isn't very surprising to anyone who's been at this channel for a little while. After that, I read another Hugo nominee. This was a novella called Thorn Hedge by T. Kingfisher. I'm pretty sure the tagline for this book goes something akin to, once upon a time there was a young princess asleep in the tower, and this is not her story. And from reading that, I was basically hooked. I love any sort of a fairy tale retelling, especially one that gives the story something of a twist. Thorn Hedge follows Toadling, a young girl who was spirited away to make room for a changeling in the king's palace. She was raised by an instinctual and ugly race of fairies known as the Green Teeth, and they taught this little human girl whatever magic that they could in order to give her her best fighting chance, because though fairies are capricious and are just as likely to kill you as they are to raise you and love you, these Green Teeth mercifully ended up loving our dear little Toadling. And Toadling has been guarding a tower for something like 200 years, isolated from the rest of this world by a wall of brambles, keeping the entirety of the world outside through its plagues and its wars and its many histories, hoping that she and the tower will be forgotten to the ages. But one day, a knight makes his way towards the tower, and Toadling catches him there, and the two of them strike up something of a wary friendship because Toadling knows that he wants to wake the sleeper in the tower, and she has to make sure that that doesn't happen. I really loved Thorn Hedge. Again, I'm just primed to love any sort of fairy tale retelling, and this sort of telling of Sleeping Beauty, where the Sleeping Beauty, while physically beautiful, was very much not what she seemed, was very interesting for me. I love a subversion of expectation, especially in fairy tale, where expectation is sort of at the heart of the way that we know the story goes. And wherever they could, T. Kingfisher, it seems, kind of gave the story a little bit of a twist. Our knight is not a prince, he is not very handsome, he is not very rich, and he is not very brave. And Toadling, the little witch that put the sleeper to sleep, is not malevolent at all, but nor is she beautiful, and nor is she very powerful ultimately against the sleeper. And I don't want to talk further about the sleeper because I feel like to do so is to spoil the rest of the novella, and I feel like this is one that if it interests you, you should give it a try. But suffice it to say that I really enjoyed the story. I found Toadling to be a deeply, deeply empathetic protagonist. Despite being a subversion of fairy tale tropes in very many ways, I feel like she still, to some degree, fits the rules for a princess in a fairy tale. She is very much one to endure, and I feel like endurance is sort of at the heart of many a princess story. I was just really happy to see Toadling get her happy ending. I feel like she deserved it, and that's all I'll say on that. I really enjoyed Thorn Hedge. Again, it's going to be some pretty stiff competition for the other Hugo nominees. And the final book that I read in April, I literally just finished it probably minutes before beginning to film at this point, was a reread of The Good Luck Girls by Charlotte Nicole Davis. The story of The Good Luck Girls follows Aster as she and her sister Clementine, along with their friends Mallow and Tansy and their sort of frenemy Violet, escape the Welcome House where all of them are branded and enslaved to essentially be sex workers after Clementine accidentally kills a brag, a patron of the house. Through a good measure of both grit and luck, the girls manage to escape the house and think that they are on their way to finding freedom and that they won't be chased after too badly until they learn that the man that Clementine killed was actually the son of a very wealthy and politically connected family. And so they will be chased come hell or high water. This news rattles the girls pretty intently, but Violet has a solution to their problem. If they can make their ways to the famed Lady Ghost, she can remove their favors, basically their slave brands, and get them a new lease on life and help them find their freedom. The only problem is that Lady Ghost services don't come cheap. They will each need to earn about 1,000 golden eagles in order to get their individual marks removed. So they start robbing people, and the story essentially follows from there. I adore The Good Luck Girls. I think that in addition to being just a really good Western fantasy, just a really delightful romp, it's also a story that has so much to say. I found the acknowledgments of this book also really powerful, and I feel like Charlotte Nicole Davis says what they want a little better than I'm currently verbalizing right now, so I'll just read it out. This is a story about, amongst other things, the power that comes from understanding your own anger and fear and turning it into something good. The way that Aster and her friends end up fighting for every scrap of everything they ever had and turning it into something worthwhile and still being angry at the heart of it and defeating that anger because it's the only way that they can meaningfully move forward was just beautiful and deeply powerful to read about. I think the relationships between these girls and also Z, one of the people who they meet along the way that helps them to their freedom, were really powerful, and I enjoyed watching them grow. I think that together they were a really good ensemble cast. I really enjoyed watching them find freedom and then revel in the sort of openness of it and finally get to express their deep anger at the wrongs that have been done to them, and then watching them from there realize that what they were doing kind of hollowed them out further and then refocus and be like, okay, where can we aim our anger? Where can we go to get shit done? And where can we go to just find peace? Because damn if we haven't earned it. It is fast-paced, it is well-characterized, it is very tense at times and at other times incredibly joyful. The girls are distinct from one another, with Aster being my secret favorite and Violet following up very close after her. I think she was also quite complex too, in a way that I was happy that we got to explore. And I'm very eager to continue with this series in the coming months. Probably next month, probably May. And in service of actually continuing reading, I'm going to cut this video off here. So that is it for me. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please leave me a thumbs up. And if you like me, maybe consider subscribing to my channel. I post videos every Thursday and I'd love to have you join my little bookish family. Comment down below if you have any thoughts on any of the books I mentioned here, or if a long comment is a little too much, I totally get it. Feel free to leave me your favorite pink emoji to let me know you've gotten to the end. But that really is it for me. Thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you with the next video very, very soon. Goodbye.